Hello and welcome to Hare and the Hawthorn. My name's Kate Ray. I'm one of your two hosts, and you've got myself and Neil today chittering on about subjects that we have been talking behind the scenes about for quite some time that we wanted to present to you. I'm going to hand you over to Neil because he's going to introduce one of the themes of today's podcast. How are you doing, Neil? Anyway, I haven't said hello, have I? That's rubbish of me.
I'm okay, Kate. Thank you very much.
Good.
Good to be back after a short break again. And today we thought we would talk about the terminology of the fairies, where the words come from, the etymology of fairies, and what we mean when we're talking about fairies. So the obvious place to start with is the etymology. Where's the word come from? And I've been looking into this recently, and it's actually a little bit more complex than you would imagine. The usual orthodoxy is that the word fairy comes from the Latin fata or fata, which is the fates, plural of fatum, the fate, the fates, which in the classical world, the fates were very fairy-like creatures. And then that got devolved into like dryads and nymphs in the classical world, which have very stark similarities with the folkloric fairies of Europe right up to modern day. But the word that might be the root of it. I think that is probably correct. But during the Middle Ages, it develops into something different than the fates and becomes fae. So Fae is Old French for the fairies, and you get that from I believe the 12th or 13th century, and that's in French, in Old French, and you don't get it until the period where Middle English. You don't get it in Britain until the period when Middle English came in, which is around about the 14th century. That's the first appearance of the word fae, or then it becomes fairy. And so it's in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's in there. That's not the first instance of it. It's earlier 14th century examples of this word suddenly appearing to describe this type of entity. And but before that, you've got 12th century chroniclers like William of Newburgh who were using the Latin term. They were called fairies fata. So when William of Newburgh was writing about the Green Children of Woolpit, that famous story, he uses the term fata for the fairies. So there's the word, and then that comes through the early modern periods where you've got, say, Edmund Spenser, the Fairy Queen, where it's become an established word, fairy. But it retains the FAE element of it. So hold on, I'm all lined up here with my books just to illustrate the point. So in Brian Froud and Alan Lee's famous book Faeries, they spell it Faeries, fairies. And that is in some ways that's the more traditional way of using it. And until the 19th century, it would usually be spelt that way. Not always. It was some writers would put an I in, some would use the E. I'm coming to why this is important. People are probably thinking, well, who cares how you spell it? But I think it's actually quite important because in the 19th century and early 20th century, it definitely became F-I F-A-I, as in the flower fairies. Now, that to me is a little bit of an issue because, as we all know, in the late 19th and early 20th century, well, throughout the 20th century, the popular cultural conception of fairies became like flower fairies or Tinkerbell, as we all know. So and the spelling would usually be with the I. Now, uh, the reason when I started writing about the subject matter, the reason I use FAE, the old traditional style spelling, is, well, partly because it's the traditional folkloric way of describing them. That's fine. That's plugging into the tradition. But I think there's a little bit more of an esoteric issue here, in that if you use the E in fairies, it's kind of the equivalent to magic with a K.
Mm.
If you talk about magic, can mean anything, can't it?
Mm-hmm.
With spelled the usual way. As soon as you put a K on the back of it, it becomes, people will realize you're talking about occultism. And I find that with fairies, which is why I always spell it with an E whenever I can, unless I'm talking about something like Photographing Fairies, the film, which is with an I. Obviously, you have to go with their spelling. So I think that's quite important,
Mm.
because we're trying to understand what the fairies are, and in a moment we're going to talk about, well, what are they? What can we include as fairy type entities? Can we sort of encompass a load of things, which we're going to talk about in a moment anyway? So that's just sort of an intro into, because a lot of people often ask me, why are you spelling fairies in that old-fashioned way? Well, yeah, well, it's old-fashioned, but it's also there's an esoteric occult reason for writing it this way. As soon as you spell it that way with the E, people in the know, people who are, even lay people who are reading about the subject, they will realize you're not talking about Tinkerbell and the flower fairies. You're talking
Yeah,
about something else.
I
Does that make
think,
sense?
yeah, totally. I think I can put it in a simpler way than that. For me, when I spell it with the E and not the I am talking about the overarching rainbow that incorporates all fairy type entities, whether that be dryads, goblins, hobgoblins, brownies, pixies, whatever. Fairy with an E is under that umbrella. Fairy with an I is in the sky. So that's how I think of it. So if it's spelt with an I, we're talking about sylphs. So we're talking about those beings of the air. And invariably, when you look at it spelt with an I within literature and art and poetry, that is what is being referred to. It's the winged, beautiful, sexualized, or very
Yeah.
childish looking
Yes.
fairies. So
Yeah.
that I use E as a distinction to say that I'm talking about all the fae and
Just as an
not just
illustration.
fairies.
Brilliant. That's it. Just as an illustration of what you're talking about. And I actually, this is Cicely Mary Barker's The Complete Book of the Flower Fairies. I actually love it.
I hate it.
It's
I've always hated it.
just to so that these are definitely fairies with an I.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whereas, oh God, I should have this easier. Fairies with an E will be much more like
Yes.
Frood and Lee's sort of
Yes.
fairy. So there's a very distinct difference. It's, in some ways, it's simply the distinction between folkloric fairies and what they became in the 19th, 20th century. But as I pointed out, I think there's a more sort of esoteric reason for it, esoteric differentiation between it, as you've just pointed out.
Yeah, definitely agree. So, do you want me to go on and talk about why this particular subject came about, why we've discussed it a number of times behind the scenes? Do you want me to start off with that?
Get on with it, yeah.
All right. So, for those of you, I'm sure the majority of the viewers know, but for those of you who don't, I am a paranormal investigator. I garbled that then. Paranormal. I usually get scared that I'm going to say a paranoid investigator when I say that.
Paranoid. Yeah. Well.
I am a paranoid investigator. So I'm a paranormal investigator. I'm a ghost hunter. I do both private and events. And every now and again, I don't watch telly per se, but every now and again, I like to just dip my toe into what's going off in the paranormal world on more mainstream media. I do catch up with certain people's live streams and that kind of thing. But there are certain programs that are my go-to programs. And one of those programs is Oh, it's completely gone. Dead files, the dead files. And I can never remember people's names, so excuse me on that. The other one that I have that's close to my heart is Help My House is Haunted. I was a contributor in series 2 for that, and Barry Guy is a good friend of mine as well. So that's quite close to my heart. So I do keep up with those guys and what they're doing. And recently, with the Dead Files, so the newer series, and I'm assuming that the newer series that I've caught up with, they have a new clairvoyant psychic on there, and one of them really did take me aback, because in previous series there had been very little mention for non-human entities, and when they are mentioned, they're mentioned more in the religious malevolent context. So this particular program that I was watching, and I don't know what series it was, because it was kind of a part snippet of the program that I'd caught up on. The lady who was a psychic medium had actually gone up into the attic of this house and quite openly said, there are elementals here. Which I was like, I have heard this in British Paranormal, but I have not come across it. And I'm sure I'm probably wrong on this, but I have personally not come across referencing to the Fae in an American program. Now, if we zip over to Help My House is Haunted, I think I'd like to think that I had a little bit of a play in why they kind of opened up to the ideas of the fairies within that program. When I was on contributing in series 2, I did a remote view on a house for them that had a particular problem, and I located what I put down to akin to a really pissed off pixie. That's the only way I can describe it. You can go and check it out. It's a brilliant one, and there for me was kind of a turning point. Barry had already internalized my kind of bugging him that there was more to hauntings than just the spirits of the dead and demons. And through his own research and through having discussions, he was very settled with that notion and that idea, and had actually started to come across these creatures within his research. And from there on in, they quite regularly encountered what they labelled imps. And that's what I want to talk about. So we have two strands of terminology there. So we have elementals being used in America, and that elementals label comes into play in Britain and in British paranormal investigation. And under that comes the word imp. I have no problem with that. In fact, I'm over the moon that the community is starting to accept that there are others, that there are other beings in the plethora of haunting environments that can do harm and can create poltergeist activity, etc. This is a whole other show, and I think we should do one definitely at some stage about fairies that haunt properties. So my little bit of a bugbear, and it's not so much of a bugbear because I am overjoyed about it, became people being hooked on the terminology, and I understand why. So, for instance, if we take the word imp, now the word imp in folklore, as far as I can find, is very seldom used, and usually in reference to Lincolnshire Cathedral and the imps that sit on Lincolnshire Cathedral, which are gargoyle-esque and almost lower demonic in how they're utilised and how they're viewed. So I had a bit of a thing about, are there really imps in the fairy realm? Is that something that's not a name that I am comfortable associating? Now, I've got to the conclusion that imps is a word that the majority of people will understand that's not a demonic, and that they can understand the behaviour of that particular entity. So whether it's a case of people have kind of transmitted onto these entities that that's the word they understand, or whether these entities are using that word so that we can understand what they are and what they're doing is one question for debate. The other side of it is elementals. Now, Neil knows I have a little bit of it grates me a little, the word elementals, and only a little. Again, I'm really pleased that the community is opening up, but elementals for me are very, very specific. You know, they came from alchemy, and they were used for very specific jobs, and then they were transmuted to magic with a K, and into that field. And I to and fro between, are elementals egregorial? So are they non-sentient beings that are thought forms that are called, like a tulpa within the environment, or are elementals really under the Fae, or have they moved into the Fae? So lots going off there to unpack. Where do you start, Neil? Where do we start?
Right, let's get into this.
Oh,
Yeah, I hope people aren't thinking this is kind of a slightly arcane subject matter, but I think it's actually quite important for
mm,
understanding the realms of the fairy, however you might imagine that and interpret it. So your terminology of elementals is needs to be taken in context, because there's an older use, exactly as you say, the older alchemical use of the term elementals, which began with Paracelsus in the 16th century. So Paracelsus was an alchemist who lived in the early 16th century. And all right, let's take a look at the book. Let me just bear with me.
I've thrown you a curveball, haven't I? You've got to
No, no,
research
no,
on the hop.
no, 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 no. I've got this up and ready, and I'm gonna completely garble this, because it's one of his volumes. He wrote a shed load of works on, mostly on alchemy, but also on philosophy and all sorts of other stuff. Most of it was published posthumously. Actually, not much was published in his lifetime, and it's especially in the volume called 1566 it was published, and it's called Ex Libro de Nymphis Sylvanis Pygmaeus Salamandris et Gigantibus, etc.
If anybody's turned into a frog out there, you can blame Neil because he's just put a freaking spell on you all.
So that's the title of Paracelsus' book, and this is where he defines the elemental world. He calls it the elemental world. I mean, Paracelsus is writing in German, but it's the same word, elemental, and he defines it, as you well know, Kate, into the sylphs of the air, the undines of the water, the salamanders of fire, and the gnomic entities of the earth. And as far as I can tell, he's the first person to do that. He's taken all sorts of stuff from classical literature, but he's the first person to define them and call them the elementals. And sure enough, he's followed up by, for instance, the Rosicrucian order went along with this and have accepted that definition of non-human intelligent entities that are split up into those elements. And then after the Rosicrucians, the Theosophy movement took that on board, but they did something different. So, I mean, Theosophy, as soon as it was formed in the late 19th century, it started branching off into, all sorts of different people having arguments with each other and branching off into different factions. But one of the primary writers, excuse me, of Theosophy in the early 20th century is Rudolf Steiner. And this book in particular, this is a series of essays written in, before the Second World War. I'm not quite sure when Steiner died. He died before the Second World War, but it's a 1920s sort of series of essays. And he expanded on these elementals and would use the term nature spirit and elemental interchangeably.
Mm.
He didn't differentiate it, that they were all the same thing, and they all fell into those elements of earth, fire, water, and air. And this this is interesting. This is more, more nomenclature. Try that one after a few ciders. Nomenclature of the fairies, because a lot of folklorists will not like the fairies being associated as nature spirits or elementals. And I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. I know exactly what you're saying about what you were saying about elementals. I'm saying something different. This is coming basically from Paracelsus and via theosophy, and they're trying to understand non-material entities that appear within our material realm and making an attempt to classify them. And I think the reason that a lot of folklorists don't like the terms nature spirits or elementals is because it's become associated with New Age thinking, and which not I don't want to sort of dish all New Age thinking, but a lot of New Age thinking will know nothing about traditional folklore, and I think a lot of traditional folklorists don't like that, and nature spirits are a little bit woo-woo, whereas the fairies are okay, because we have centuries of literature describing them, and nature spirits have only become something since the 20th century. But that's not true. You can go back to Paracelsus, and even if you go back to the classical world, they're kind of nature spirits. They're much more in that remit than the folkloric fairies, who can often be, they don't care about nature. They're just malevolent little bastards.
Yeah, be careful
So
what you say.
they know what I think of them. But you know what I mean. A lot of folklore is, they can be malicious, and they've got nothing to do with growing crops or being part of the natural world. But uh, I think that's a false distinction. I think that all however we can understand things in different ways, and you can go down the route of, this is my final book that I'll be showing you, and talk about garbling someone's name, Marco Pogachnik.
That sounds nothing like it should.
Nature Spirits and Elemental Beings. It's a brilliant book. He's a superb psychic, and he describes in this book and others how he interacts as a psychic with what he calls nature spirits and elementals. He again doesn't make any differentiation. They're interchangeable terms, but often what he's talking about, to me, they're fairy type entities. You can't make the distinction between, for instance, he'll see the beings in a tree, and what he describes, the beings in that tree are very close, if not identical, to both the traditional folkloric descriptions of fairies and also modern descriptions of fairies. And so that's that's a bit of a long rambling way of saying that you need to be careful about making too strict distinctions between these type of non-human intelligent entities. And as we know from discussions, you can bring other things in. You can bring aliens in. You can bring ghosts in, or any kind of zoomorphic creature that doesn't have a full material presence on Earth. Something that is at least sometimes non-material. You could pack them all into the same box and say, okay, there's different types of people's and the way people's preconceived consciousness when interacting with one of these beings. I might see a nature spirit, whereas you're seeing a winged fairy, and it's all, a lot of it is to do with the human consciousness that is experiencing it, whereas in fact it's all, whatever you want to call it, energy, non-material life form. It's all the same, and we're just interpreting it through our
Receptors.
senses in the material world.
I totally agree. I'm still I'm still in the firm belief that the word elemental should be left within the alchemy realm, and because I find it incredibly restrictive, and incredibly restrictive in that sense that you've just talked about how we receive these beings, how they want to be received. That's called into question. Do we receive them how we can understand them? Do they present how they want to present? Are they fixed in matter when they come through into our plane? Are they permanently on our plane? And what elementals does is say that there are only 4 realms where these beings exist. And it's almost as strict that they are not interchangeable, that you would never see a gnome as a ball of light, which we know happens, or we would never see a winged fairy dipping in and out the ocean, which we know
Yep.
happens. And I just think that when the term elemental is used solely to talk about fairy with an E, it becomes very, very restrictive, because the menagerie of fae that are out there that have been reported in things like Simon Young's census are just huge. They are, they are beings that look like they are twigs. They are beings that look like they're leaves. And I think nature spirit as well is not as restricted, but has got those shackles of restriction on them, because these are etherical astral beings. Um, they're not for us to sort of pin down like butterflies on the earth as material things. And herein, is the start of the crux of the question of what is a fairy. It's not something to be pinned down. We can't. And as soon as you start,
Yep.
you find out that you're absolutely wrong.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean, and I, I think the term elementals has mostly gone out of use. People will not say elemental; they will say nature spirit. And although the same thing, well, that's a discussion that could go on for hours, isn't it? But
Mm,
it's but what one th but modern perceptions of fairies is interesting, I think. I'm not just talking about the traditional folklore. I'm talking about what modern people think of fairies, and it's something on this channel and in our writings, we're constantly grappling with, in terms of what is a fairy, and it's in some ways an unanswerable question. But it's interesting looking at. So I just in the last week or so, I've been looking through in a little bit of detail at the new fairy census edited by our friend Dr. Simon Young, and available for anyone to go and find at the Fairy Investigation Society's webpage. And it's fascinating. It's this is the follow-up to the first census in 2017, which had about 500 reports, and now there's another 500 reports. There's a difference in this second census. It's more detail. People seem to be willing to put more detail in. But for just before this podcast, I thought it'd be useful to take a look at both of them to see how, because one of the questions in the census is, what do you think fairies are?
mm,
And in both of them, excuse me, in both of them, out of the 500 reports, about 50 something people say nature spirits.
mm.
They are nature spirits. And if you can, I just read one of
Please
them,
do.
which I found today, which it's interesting on many levels, not just the level we're talking about. For instance, it's actually a double experience. It's a multi-person experience. So that makes it always makes it especially interesting. But this just gives you an idea of a modern person, very recent years, how they think of fairies. And so let me oh no, let me get the type up to the size I can see.
Because you'll
um
be squinting.
yeah. So it's only take a couple of minutes.
Yep.
Just bear with me, everyone, and we will read out number 517. This is from the new census, which is from Devon, and the lady who is reporting it is in her 40s. So she says, it was June 2016. I was with my mum walking through a lovely moorland garden, which only opens every summer. Mum and I had been looking around the gardens, and we were on the way back to the cafe. We were in good spirits as we had just been laughing at an unflattering photo that she'd taken of me. We were walking on a footpath. You can see what I mean about the detail. People are, it's like a little biography going on here, just to sort of build you up to the main event. To the left side of the path, is lawn backed by bushes and a stream running towards a large pond. We were walking past a large log on the lawn to our left. As we walked by, I clearly saw out the corner of my eye a little person dressed in brown with brown skin perched on the end of the log. He was sat with his knees up and arms wrapped around his knees, looking sideways to me and my mum. To me, he felt mischievous and curious. It was a flash of a few seconds. I exclaimed to my mum, "Oh, there's a pixie." And she replied, "Yes, pixie." We were very matter of fact about it and carried on walking and talking. When I looked more closely at the log, I saw that the place where the pixie had been sitting was the stump of a branch sticking out from the log. I felt very excited by this experience. Mum was diagnosed with cancer about 6 months after this, in the early part of 2017. So I feel perhaps we had this experience because she was in a liminal place with her health. I've often reminded my mum of this, but recently her memory has faded. However, the other day when I asked, "Do you remember when we saw the pixie?" she said, "Yeah, we saw a pixie. Brown skin, brown clothing, brown pointed cap, short trousers, long sleeve top." Mischievous expression, grinning dark eyes, 12 inches or so high. And then the experiencer says, "Why was this fairy experience?" It's because that's what I feel it was. And it looked like it was a nature spirit, same colors as nature. Fairies are nature spirits and part of nature. This was a very special experience and turning point in my life and Mum's. It's lovely. It's a lovely account, isn't it? And it's kind
It's
of
beautiful, yeah.
not you can't really say any one account is typical of all of the others, but that does give you an idea of how much detail people are going into, and they really want to in the second census much more so than the first census. But what I want to point out there is, apart from the multi-person experience, which is very interesting, she's describing, what is she describing there? She's describing a kind of Brian Froud
Mm.
fairy, isn't she?
Mm.
And yet when asked what are the fairies, well, they're nature spirits. It's the color of nature. um
I
and
often
and so there, so out of those 500 experiences in this second census, around about 50 people say almost exactly the same. They're nature spirits, they're part of nature, they're propagating nature.
I wonder whether we're being duped by that though. Have had this conversation quite recently about whether we're being duped in the fact that we think them as nature spirits because they blend in with their environment, and oftentimes people do report them looking like the rocks that surround them, or they look like, you know, something in the forest, or the flower fairies, you know, they look like they're wearing flowers, so they would blend in that environment. Answer me this: if you are a diminutive, smaller ethereal being that wants to come into this realm for whatever reason, whether it to be interact or observe humans, or to be in this environment for whatever reason, you don't want to be seen. They don't generally want to be seen. It's very rare that we see them on a regular basis, else everybody would believe in the fairies. What are you going to do? You're going to camouflage yourself. You're going to make sure that you fit into that environment. So you don't necessarily come from or are born of the energy of that environment, but you imbue that energy. So maybe we are being duped with the whole nature spirit aspect, that they are literally just using it as camouflage. You know, we talk about UFOs camouflaging themselves in the sky, making sure that they fit in with that environment so they go unspotted, and that kind of thing. So are we
That,
being duped?
well, that would fit into the trickster element of
Mm.
fairy folklore in general. You know, they're playing tricks. They mess around with you, mess around with your mind. um, or maybe they're not doing it on purpose, and there's just a disparity between our understanding of what they are and what they are. We just don't understand, and so we interpret it as the nature spirits.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Um, uh, uh, One thing we talked about many times is pareidolia
Yes.
especially in trees for me, and I see it all of the time. I and people say, well, it's just pareidolia, it's just your brain making faces up. And well, okay, maybe to a certain extent, but I think there's more to it than that. I think I think that pareidolia is actually a threshold.
Mm.
And these could genuinely be called nature spirits because they're part of, in this instance, trees. And the threshold where they become real humanoid entities, fairy entities, hasn't been reached because your state of consciousness isn't quite in the same place. So you're just seeing, oh, there's a face in that tree, and sometimes you will look back and the face will have changed. It's not always the same. And you think that's odd. Am I being sent a message? Is that just me just not able to get over that threshold to have a full blown fairy encounter? Maybe it's. I mean, this is conjectural, I know, but this fits into that very much fits into the fairies as nature spirits, and I don't really have a problem with it. I think, like I say, I think there is a metaphysical, non-material reality, standalone reality, and we encounter that whole in various ways, but we are encountering it, the whole. It's one big metaphysical standalone reality which we tap into every now and then. Sometimes you see a nature spirit, sometimes you see a winged fairy, sometimes you see a gnome. Actually, they're all they may have different purposes, but they are actually coming from the same place.
I think they're definitely from the same plane. And just as you were talking about pareidolia, then it did make me think that maybe I'm being a bit unfair on the nature spirit element. I do think that nature has a spirit, but I don't think it's necessarily fairy. I think fairy attach themselves to the spirit of nature. So where we see pareidolia in trees is that the tree sending us signals of its sentience. Yes. Where a fairy will be attached to certain trees and have a relationship with certain trees. They are not necessarily nature spirits. The nature spirits come from the physical natural world and the sentience of the physical natural world. And even science is more and more coming to the conclusion that they now say that plants can see and recognize human beings who come into contact with them on a regular basis. That's mind-blowing. 10 years ago, if you'd have said that, you'd have been a pot-smoking hippie and you need to go and sober yourself up, but scientists now know that plants have receptors that are as good, if not better, at identifying different human beings. So they are sentient beings. So
which is why I always have my special trees on my daily walk where
that
I
you
always
give a
stop.
hug to.
Oh, I do. I go and have a few little words with them, and I just I don't want to sound too hippie woo woo, but yeah, they're contacting me. They know who I am.
Yeah,
I can feel it, and the pareidolia in these trees is just amazing, and it changes from day to day. And yeah, so yeah.
I mean,
We're going off on one here.
we are. I mean, I'm going to end that little segment with I am that woo woo. I am that woo woo that I apologise when I pull up weeds. I apologise to the weed and say, I'm sorry, you can't live here. This is not the place for you, because I feel really bad. Even when I put it in the compost bin, I just want to give it a little burial. Say a few words for it.
I'm exactly the same. It's even a buddleia is tearing up my wall out there. Sorry, fellow. And I usually give it fair warning. I say, right, you've got a couple of days. I'm afraid you're going to have to go.
Yeah.
And then again, I do it, and it does feel so. I don't really want to do it. It's just something trying to live, and it's inconvenient for me, and so I stop it living. So you do need to make that apology to it before you chop the weeds. So we have gone woo-woo here.
We have,
people are going to think, oh no,
don't listen to them anymore. Don't listen to the bloody hippies anymore. So just to round it up, and we've got a few more minutes, and I just want to talk about a subject that absolutely mind boggles me, and it's something that I've toed and froed upon for a long time. And that's fairy music. And I know we said we'd do a specific one about fairy music, but we do want to find the right person to talk to about this, because I think for me it's a subject that hasn't been opened in the way it should be open, because it's fascinating. So one of the things that have bugged me for a very long time was the question of why is fairy music stuck in a particular era. It seems to have got to a certain period that corresponds with the progression of human music tastes and genres, and then it cuts off and stops. And our very good friend Rob Wildwood dropped in to see me earlier on this week, and I sat and asked him the question of what is fairy music and can it be modern? And we had this to and fro conversation where he said, no, no, it's traditionally, people hear bells and they hear harps and they hear violins, etc. And we know from fairy folklore that the fairies will teach the fiddle player in Ireland how to play a fiddle like no other, and this music is meant to bring about emotions like no other music on this earthly plane. That's all good and well, but I truly do believe that the fairies didn't stop there, that the fairies are muses and will choose people to be muses. And there are people within the industry even now who I hear their music and it's not what you'd think, but I hear their music and I think there is something not of this world in how they're playing an instrument or how they're singing or the composition of what they're doing. And I go to fairy fairs and fairy festivals, and the music's lovely. It's not my taste, but it's stuck in a genre. And there's the furthest that it's kind of got within in human evolutionary terms of music is folklore. Is folk music, sort of fiddly folk music, and that's it. And it's like it's on a psychic level, but I sometimes hear particularly pixie-esque beings going, we like rave, we like a good mashup, we like chaos, and we like to dance, and we like this shamanic drumming that's going off in the beats of things. We do love the etherical music, but we want it to be different. We evolve too. And one of the things that Rob Wildwood said to me was, but people who have fairy experiences of music, where it's a DVP, where they don't see anything, where it's a direct voice phenomena, direct audio phenomena, they hear bells, or they hear harps, or they hear beautiful siren harmonics of women's voices, or occasionally they'll hear drumming. And I said, okay, then this is the question. This is a question I've got for you as well, Neil. Imagine yourself in a field in the middle of nowhere, say in Scotland or Wales, and you know that the nearest village is miles and miles away and you haven't come across any dwellings anywhere. And you hear rave music just fluttering in on the wind. What do you think?
I would think that there are a group of people on shrooms about a mile away having a
Yes.
rave.
But isn't that fairy? Isn't that a fairy thing? So if you were to hear that music and follow that music and still
Yeah,
you didn't find the source of that music,
yeah.
nowhere in your psyche would you attach that to the fairies. You would just think, oh, it's blowing in audibly from somewhere and there's been something created within the environment that's touched my ears. But you wouldn't think fairy. People wouldn't think fairy. And it frustrates me. I feel like I should be advocating on fairies to say they do like modern music. They do. They inspire people.
It's interesting. That's not something I'd really thought about. Why haven't the fairies updated their musical repertoire? And it could be that again we're coming back to that misinterpretation of non-human intelligent entities, and maybe they are producing techno. Who knows? Just one thing that reminds me, seeing as everyone like the usual picture of Fields of the Nephilim,
Yes.
the cover to their album Morning Sun, and there was an interview many years ago with Carl McCoy, who is the main man in Fields of the Nephilim. And the question was something along the lines of, where are you getting your influence from? Because some of your stuff sounds quite demonic. And he said it's not demonic, it's elemental. Now I don't know what he meant, but I don't know whether he meant it's elementals. He was saying that, but basically he's partly channeling elemental messages. I must look into that again because he might go into detail. But there you go. There's an example.
Mm.
There are the fairies. working through fields of the Nephilim to produce some very dark music
Energetic music,
states.
but it is
Yeah,
energetic. It is
yeah,
imbued with a very distinct energy, isn't it? The
yeah.
fields, they are definitely are. Now, if anybody's out there who's a musician who plays modern music, who feels that they have had an influence from the fairies, we'd love to hear from you. Or anybody who has a take on this, because it is one of those things that it's one of those things that keeps me awake at night. Of all the crazy things in the world to keep me awake, and it's fairy music. I mean, for me and Neil have talked before, and people like Coco Rosie, who were late 90s, early 2000s. They were seen as trip hop. They were put under the trip hop banner, I think. They, to me, are fairy music. The
Mm,
composition of it's sublime, but it's chaos.
yeah.
It's beautiful chaos, and it is just it's out of this world. And
And
there's
that, and the two girls in the band look very fairy like, don't they? They're
and
just,
sing
my
very
goodness.
fairy like,
Yeah,
don't they?
yeah.
They've got that very kind of ethereal, but they're both classically trained, I think, as well, which is interesting that they took the route that they took. But if anybody wants to go and have a listen to that and to see, for me, that's perfect pixie music. Or there's the recent singer, Aurora. I think she's called Aurora. She's another one. I look at her; she's very Bjork-esque in her mannerisms, and she's slightly not unhinged, but she's slightly not of this world. So she kind of comes in and out when she's giving interviews, and I love her. I think she is amazing. But her music and the way she moves is, for me, modern fairy. So at some point I think we have to accept the fact that the fairies maybe laid down their harps quite a long time ago, and
Well,
those.
they can do both, can't they?
Of course they can. They can do
You can
whatever they bloody want.
you can play rock music and you can play folk music, and so yeah, I think it's probably a case of both. Just to finish off on that,
Yeah.
another thing in that there are several examples of in the new census of music,
Yes.
sometimes accompanied by a visual encounter, and sometimes the person just hears music. I don't know how many out of the 500 there are, but well, probably a few dozen. Where so that would be interesting, just to
Mm,
really go into detail and look what sort of music are they. The ones that I can remember off the top of my head were bells.
yes.
Bell,
That
yeah,
is the classic one, isn't it?
yeah.
Bells from Nowhere, which is interesting in itself. And it's something that I'm exploring at the minute, because it's said that fairies hate the sound of church bells.
Church bells
So
specifically, yeah,
we're talking about frequencies here, aren't we? And maybe
yeah,
that's
yeah.
some key into the fairy music aspect of it, where it's things at a certain frequency that they perhaps enjoy more than other frequencies. Something to look into, definitely. I think we should do some exploration on that. But like I say, if anybody's out there who has a viewpoint on this, who works in the music industry, who's been influenced, or um, let's just find somebody, please, who can talk to us about this subject, because I'm certainly no expert on it, but it is bugging my mind, so I'd like to pursue it a bit further. So just before we pop off, because it gets to that time where Neil has to have something to eat, else he turns into a really grumpy house brownie. We're just we're just going to talk you through. We've got a couple of guests that are definitely in the lineup. And who are they, Neil?
Yeah, well, we haven't done many interviews this year, but we do have a few lined up in the very near future. In the next month, we're going to be talking but both of them return guests. First off, from the US will be Joshua Cutchin, who is an incredible fount of knowledge on all things fairy. And last year he published his first novel, which is a very good read and has some very dark fairies in it. I don't know how much we'll be able to talk with him about that, without giving away spoilers, but we'll work that out. And there's plenty more to talk about with Joshua. And also a return visitor will be from Ireland, David Halpin, who is a brilliant folklorist, and but he's always looking for an esoteric angle on every. He doesn't just do the traditional. He's great at researching traditional Irish folklore, but he always brings a new angle of esoterica to it. So those two will be coming on in the next month.
Yep. And we may be having another guest. I'm not going to give too much away, but I'm just going to show you a bit of a corner of a book. I'm excited about all the guests we have on, and I must admit that Joshua and David, David, where did that come from?
Yeah, that's his handle on Facebook. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's okay then. That's okay. They both blow my mind, and I find myself forgetting that I'm actually recording, and I sit there like,
Yeah.
and kind of don't know what to say. And I love the fact that they just kind of, just plow on and just they are mind blowing, absolutely mind blowing guests to have on. I mean, we've had lots of mind blowing guests, but I'm so pleased to have them back. Just going to show you a bit of a corner of a book. There we go. That's all I'm giving you, because I haven't confirmed with this particular person that I'm going to bully them to come on the show. I don't think they'll take much bullying, to talk about this amazingly beautiful book, which yeah, I'm not going to give too much away about, because it's definitely in there in my bookshelf as a very beloved book already, and I've only just recently acquired it, so that'd be quite exciting. We have later on in the year, we have some other returning guests who are going to be updating us about the work that they've been doing. So we'll be talking to somebody specifically about remote viewing later on in the year, which is something that I'm super interested in. It's something that I always look to kind of develop as well, so that's going to be great. And if you've got any suggestions, as always, that would be fantastic. So pop them in the comments, let us know who you want to see on board. If there's anybody you want to give a nudge and say, you know what, you'd be great on the show, we're always open. We're always open to have people on to discuss things. And fair is the kind of core of things, and we're quite happy to expand out and to look at the peripheries of that. So, any last words, Neil?
No last words. I just that's been a very enjoyable conversation, and I really hope people understand why we've been talking about this. It can, it can seem, the nomenclature and the etymology of words can seem a little bit arcane sometimes, but I hope we've explicated tonight how and why it's important. So yeah, no, really useful conversation, and hope people like it.
And as always, we read your comments, although we don't get back to you on this platform particularly, because we're both pretty shit at technology. So I do apologise for that, but we do read them all, and occasionally we'll read out some of the comments in a specific podcast, just because of caught our eye, or we endeavour to answer them. And the ongoing "What's in Neil's goblet?"
Like the Holy Grail going across there.
Yeah, I think it's only two people who've actually got it right. So that is an ongoing competition with no real winners, just a bit of fun. I'd like to say I'd send you out something, but that's never going to happen, because it means going to the freaking post office and doing things like that. So I'm sorry. You'll get a mention on the show. You'll get a hello and a mention. How about that? So I think we'll keep that running probably till about, I was going to say midsummer, but we're nearly bloody midsummer. It's pissing it down out there, and it's been freezing today. Yep. So I think I tell you what, we're going to keep the goblet thing running probably until we get some bloody sunshine, and then we'll reveal all.
Yep.
How about that? All right, thank you very much, Neil, and we'll catch up really, really soon.
Okay, thank you, Kate. See you, everyone.